Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Jerry Caldwell, and I've been a ranger in Jefferson National Forest for 16 years now. Folks around here know me pretty well. I'm third-generation Appalachian, born and raised in these mountains. My great-grandfather was half Cherokee, used to scout these ridges back in the old days. He taught my grandfather the old ways, and my grandfather taught me. Things like which plants can heal you and which ones will kill you. How to read animal tracks in mud so soft you can barely see them. How to find water when the streams run dry. I guess you could say these mountains are in my blood. The divorce papers came through last spring. Sarah took the boys. Tommy's 15 now, Jake's 13, and moved them down to Richmond where her sister lives. Said she was tired of the isolation, tired of me being gone for days at a time on search and rescue calls. Can't say I blame her. This job takes a toll on family life. Now it's just me and about 200 square miles of some of the most beautiful and dangerous wilderness in Virginia. Devil's Backbone Ridge sits right in the heart of my territory, a jagged line of peaks that runs north to south for about 12 miles. The Cherokee used to call it something else, but the name's been lost. What hasn't been lost are the stories. Every mountain community has its tales, and around here they're all about the hollow folk. Supposedly, there are people living deep in the caves and hidden valleys who aren't quite right. My great-grandfather used to tell stories about the Nunahai, Cherokee spirits who lived inside the mountains, immortal beings who could look just like regular people but weren't really alive at all. I never put much stock in those old stories. Mountain hollows breed tall tales like stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. In 16 years of walking these ridges, I've seen black bears, wild boar, the occasional mountain lion, and plenty of lost hikers. But I've never seen anything that couldn't be explained by good old-fashioned common sense. That changed in October of 1971. The weather that month was all wrong. Days would start warm, sometimes hitting 70 degrees, then plummet to near freezing after sunset. The fog would roll in thick as cotton batting and wouldn't burn off until noon, sometimes later. The trees were confused. Some had already dropped their leaves, while others were still green as summer. Animals were acting strange, too. Deer would bolt at the sound of my footsteps from a quarter-mile away. Birds weren't migrating like they should. Even the insects seemed off. Too quiet during the day, too loud at night. But the real problem was the radio. See, Devil's Backbone Ridge sits on top of some of the richest iron ore deposits in Virginia. That iron plays hell with electronics. Compasses spin like weather vanes in a tornado. Radio signals get bent and twisted until you're picking up truckers from Tennessee when you're trying to reach the main station 47 miles away in Natural Bridge. That isolation never bothered me before. I know every cave, every trail, every water source within 50 miles. I've pulled 23 lost hikers out of these mountains, most of them alive. The locals trust me. The Virginia State Police call me when they have missing persons cases in my territory. But that October, the isolation felt different, heavier, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. It was a Tuesday morning when Chuck Brennan came stumbling into my station, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Chuck runs hunting parties out of his lodge down in Buena Vista, mostly city folks who want to bag a 10-point buck and have stories to tell back in Washington or Richmond. Good man. Knows these mountains almost as well as I do. "Jerry," he said, and his voice, he was shaking. "I need your help. We got 8 hunters missing up on Devil's Backbone." I poured him coffee and got him sitting down before I asked for details. Chuck's not the type to spook. Easy, but his hands were trembling so bad he could barely hold the cup. "Took a party up there yesterday morning," he said. 8 men from Richmond. Been planning this trip for months. Experienced hunters, good equipment. We set up camp at Devil's Backbone Falls, right where the trail splits toward the ridge. I knew the spot. Good campsite, protected from wind, close to fresh water. This morning I sent them out in pairs, Chuck continued. 4 different directions, planned to meet back at camp by noon for lunch. I stayed behind to clean up, maybe catch some fish for dinner. He took a shaky sip of coffee. Jerry, I was only gone from camp for maybe 20 minutes to check the fish lines downstream. When I came back, they were all sitting around the fire like nothing had happened. That's good, I said. Sounds like they came back early. No, you don't understand. Chuck's eyes went wide. They were sitting there, all 8 of them, having coffee and talking. But when I called out to them, they just disappeared. I set down my own cup. What do you mean, disappeared? I mean, they vanished, Jerry, like smoke. 1 second they were there, clear as day. The next second I was looking at an empty campsite. But the coffee was still steaming in their cups. Food was half eaten on their plates. Their gear was all there, rifles, packs, everything. Chuck leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've been hunting these mountains for 30 years. I've never seen anything like it. And Jerry, those men are still out there somewhere. I radioed the main station and got authorization for a search and rescue operation. Chuck led me up to the campsite on Devil's Backbone Ridge, and what I found there made my skin crawl. Everything was exactly like he'd described. 8 sleeping bags laid out in a neat circle around a stone fire ring. Coffee pots still warm on the coda. Also, plates of half-eaten bacon and eggs sitting on a fallen log they'd been using as a table. But no sign of the hunters themselves. Their gear was what really bothered me. These weren't inexperienced city boys with cheap equipment. I found 8 high-end hunting rifles, all loaded and ready to fire. Expensive Zeiss binoculars, professional-grade packs that probably cost more than I made in a month, wallets stuffed with cash and credit cards. Nobody leaves that kind of equipment behind, not willingly. I called for Chuck to stay put while I walked the perimeter of the campsite, looking for tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for reading sign. I found 8 sets of boot prints leading away from camp in 4 different directions, just like Chuck had said. 2 men had headed north toward the ridgeline. 2 went east down the ravine. 2 went south toward Dead Man's Cave, and 2 went west along the old logging road. I decided to follow the north trail first. The tracks were clear for about 200 yards. Then they started getting strange. The stride length was too regular, like the men were marching in perfect step. The depth of the prints was exactly the same, which shouldn't happen when 2 different people are walking on uneven ground. Then, about a quarter mile from camp, the tracks just stopped. Not faded away, not obscured by rocks or thick brush. Just stopped, mid-stride, at the edge of a small clearing. Beyond that point, nothing. No trampled vegetation. No disturbed leaves. No scuff marks on rocks. It was like the 2 hunters had simply stepped out of existence. I called out, shouting their names until my voice echoed off the ridges. No response. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no insects, not even wind in the trees. Just an unnatural silence that made my ears ring. I backtracked and followed the east trail. Same thing. Clear prints, or a couple hundred yards. Then nothing. The men who'd gone south toward Dead Man's Cave, their tracks led right to the mouth of the cave and vanished. I shined my flashlight into the saw. Darkness, and called out, but the only answer was my own voice bouncing back at me. The west trail was the worst. Those tracks led along the old logging road for maybe 300 yards, then turned off into thick brush that should have been impossible to navigate quietly. But I found broken branches and disturbed undergrowth for another 100 yards, then nothing. In the middle of a thicket so dense I could barely squeeze through it myself, the trail just ended. By the time I got back to camp, Chuck was pacing around the fire like a caged animal. Find anything? He asked. Tracks, I said. But they don't make sense. I was about to explain when my radio crackled to life. Station 7, this is base. Come in, Station 7. That was Tom Hensley, my backup. Good man. Been doing this job almost as long as me. I keyed the mic. Base, this is Station 7. Go ahead, Tom. Jerry, we got a problem. Just got a call from some folks down in Buena Vista. They're reporting seeing you walking along Route 130 about an hour ago. I looked at Chuck. then back at the radio. "Tom, I've been up on Devil's Backbone Ridge all morning. Haven't been near Route 130. "That's what I figured. But Jerry, the description matches you perfectly. Down to that scar on your left hand and the way you walk with your right shoulder a little higher than your left." A chill ran down my spine. Only a few people knew about that shoulder injury. Caught some shrapnel in Vietnam that never healed quite right. "You sure it wasn't just someone who looked like me?" I asked. "Jerry, the woman who called it in was Mrs. Patterson from the general store. She's known you since you were a kid. Says she waved at you and you waved back, but your eyes were wrong. Said you looked like you were sleepwalking." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Tom, how long ago was this sighting?" "About an hour, right around the time you radioed in about the missing hunters. But I'd been on Devil's Backbone Ridge for 2 hours, minimum. It was physically impossible for me to have been in 2 places at once. Tom, I need you up here. Bring the search dogs and call the state police. We've got something strange happening up here." "Copy that. ETA 90 minutes. I clipped the radio back to my belt and looked at Chuck. His face had gone pale. "Jerry," he said quietly, "when I saw those 8 hunters sitting around the fire this morning, they looked just as real as you do right now. But when they disappeared, I could still see them for a few seconds, like they were made of smoke or mist. You didn't mention that before. Would you have believed me?" I started to say yes, but the words stuck in my throat. Because the truth was, I was starting to see things myself. Movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that didn't match their objects. And twice now, while following those impossible tracks, I'd caught glimpses of men in hunting gear moving through the trees ahead of me. But when I'd called out, they'd vanished. Just like the 8 hunters sitting around Chuck's campfire. Just like whoever was walking around Buena Vista wearing my face. The fog was starting to roll in again, even though it was barely noon. Thick gray tendrils that seemed to move against the wind, and somewhere in that fog I could swear I heard voices, men talking in low, urgent whispers, but I couldn't make out the words. Tom arrived with 2 bloodhounds and a grim expression. The dogs picked up the missing hunter's scent easily enough at the campsite, but when they reached the spots where the tracks disappeared, both animals started whining and backing away. The younger dog, Rex, actually tucked his tail and ran back to Tom's truck. "Never seen them act like this," Tom said, trying to coax the dogs forward. "And it's like they're scared of something we can't see." That's when I told him about the false sighting in Buena Vista. Tom's a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, but I watched. His face changed as I described the radio call. "Jerry," he said slowly, "I got another call on the way up here. Gas station attendant in Lexington says you stopped for fuel about 30 minutes ago. Paid cash, didn't say a word, just stared at him with what he called empty eyes." My blood went cold. "Tom, I haven't left this ridge all day." "I know that. Question is, who's impersonating you and why?" Before I could answer, Chuck called out from across the clearing, "You men need to see this." We found him standing next to the stone fire ring, pointing at something in the ashes. Mixed in with the charcoal and burnt wood were pieces of metal that looked like old military equipment. Brass buttons, belt buckles, what appeared to be fragments of a Civil War-era musket. "This wasn't here this morning," Chuck said. "I cleaned out this fire pit myself before the hunters used it." Tom knelt down and carefully extracted a brass button with his pocket knife. The metal was green with age, but you could still make out part of an inscription. S.A. Confederate States of America. "How old you think this stuff is?" Tom asked. 110 years, give or take, I said. "But that's impossible. This fire was burning this morning." As if to prove my point, I could feel heat still radiating from the coals. That's when we heard the voices. They came from the North Trail, the same direction where I'd found the first set of impossible tracks. Men talking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't make out words, but the voices sounded wrong somehow, too flat, no emotion. "Hello?" Tom called out. "Jefferson National Forest Service. Identify yourselves." The voices stopped immediately. We waited in silence for maybe 30 seconds, then heard footsteps on the trail. Slow, measured steps, like a military patrol. Tom drew his service pistol, and I did the same. Chuck picked up one of the abandoned hunting rifles. Two men appeared through the fog at the edge of the clearing. They were wearing modern hunting gear, orange safety vests, camouflage pants, expensive boots. But something was fundamentally wrong with the way they moved. Their steps were perfectly synchronized, like marionettes controlled by the same hand. Their heads turned in exact unison when they saw us. And their eyes were completely empty. Not just empty of emotion, but empty of anything resembling consciousness. Like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. "Are you part of the Chuck Brennan hunting party?" Tom called out. The two men opened their mouths to respond, but no sound came out. They moved their lips and gestured with their hands, but it was like watching a silent movie. After a few seconds, they pointed deeper into the forest and began walking back the way they'd come. "Hey!" I shouted. "Stop!" But they kept walking, maintaining that eerie, synchronized pace. Tom and I followed, leaving Chuck to guard the campsite. The fog was getting thicker, making it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. The two hunters stayed just at the edge of our vision, always the same distance ahead, no matter how fast we walked. They led us off the trail and into a part of the forest I'd never seen before, which should have been impossible. I know every square inch of Devil's Backbone Ridge, but the landscape around us was all wrong. Trees grew in perfect straight lines. Boulders were arranged in geometric patterns. Even the fog moved in regular, rhythmic waves. After about 10 minutes of this surreal pursuit, the two hunters stopped at the mouth of a cave I'd never seen before. They turned toward us one final time, pointed into the darkness, then simply faded away like smoke. Tom and I stood there staring at the spot where they'd been. "Please tell me you saw that too," Tom said. "I saw it. Question is, what the hell was it?" We approached the cave mouth cautiously. It was bigger than it had looked from a distance, maybe 12 feet high and 20 feet wide. The opening seemed to absorb our flashlight beams instead of reflecting them, but I could see something scattered on the ground just inside the entrance. More equipment, modern hunting gear mixed with older items. I spotted a leather cartridge belt that looked like it came from World War I, a beaver fur hat that belonged in a museum, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that could have been 100 years old. "Tom," I said quietly, "I think we found where the missing people go." "Missing people? You mean the 8 hunters?" "Not just them. Look at this stuff. People have been disappearing in these mountains for a long time." As if summoned by my words, more figures appeared in the fog around us. Men in hunting gear, men in military uniforms, men in the rough clothing of fur trappers and homesteaders, all of them moving with that same mechanical precision, all of them with those terrible empty eyes, and all of them slowly closing in around us. Tom raised his pistol, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I whispered. "I don't think bullets will stop them." The hollow men, because that's what they were, I realized, empty shells of people who'd disappeared over the decades, formed a loose circle around us. They didn't speak, didn't threaten, just stood there watching us with those dead eyes. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice calling from somewhere in the fog. "Tom, Chuck, where are you guys? I think I found something." But I was standing right there. I wasn't calling out to anyone. Tom looked at me with wide eyes. "Jerry, if you're here with me, then who?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Tom, I need help over here." And through the fog, I saw myself walking toward us. Same clothes, same ranger hat, same scar on my left hand. But the eyes were wrong. Empty. Dead. Just like all the others. The thing wearing my face stopped about 10 feet away and smiled. It was my smile, perfectly reproduced, but completely without warmth or recognition. When it spoke, it used my voice, but with a strange, flat intonation. "You should not have come here," it said. "What are you?" I managed to ask. "I am you, as they are them." It gestured toward the circle of hollow men. "We are the collected, the preserved, the eternally watching." Tom still had his gun raised, but his hand was shaking. "Jerry, this is impossible." The thing wearing my face turned its attention to Tom. "Thomas Hensley, age 38, wife Margaret, daughter Sarah, age 7. You fear dying before you see her grow up." Tom's face went white. That fear, about dying before his daughter grew up, was something he'd confided to me during a particularly difficult search and rescue operation last year. Something no one else could have known. "How do you know that?" Tom whispered. "I know because Jerry knows. I am Jerry, just as they are who they were. The difference is that we serve a higher purpose now." More figures emerged from the fog. I recognized some of them from old missing persons cases, hikers who'd vanished over the years, hunters who'd never come home. But others were much older, men in Confederate gray, fur trappers in buckskin, even what looked like Cherokee warriors in traditional dress, and they were all moving closer. "What purpose?" I asked. The thing with my face tilted its head like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. "The Guardian speaks. He has watched these mountains for 300 years. He collects those who trespass on sacred ground, preserves their forms, uses their knowledge." Guardian? You would call him medicine man, shaman. He made a bargain with the mountain spirits long ago. Eternal life in exchange for eternal service. He protects what lies beneath. A new voice spoke from deeper in the cave, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Cherokee, but ancient Cherokee, the old tongue my great-grandfather sometimes used in his stories. "Bring them forward. The collection must be complete." The hollow men began closing in. Tom fired his pistol twice, but the bullets passed right through the nearest figure without effect. The man didn't even flinch. That's when I remembered my great-grandfather's stories. Not just the tales about the Nunahai, but the protections. The old ways of dealing with spirits and the walking dead. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch I'd carried for 16 years. A gift from my great-grandfather containing sacred tobacco and a piece of iron from the old Cherokee settlement. Every ranger in Appalachian country carries something like it, usually without really believing in its power. "Tom," I said quietly, "when I tell you to run, head straight back toward the main trail. Don't look back, don't stop, and don't let them surround you." I opened the pouch and scattered the tobacco on the ground while speaking the Cherokee protection prayer my great-grandfather had taught me as a child. The words felt rusty in my mouth. I hadn't spoken Cherokee in years, but they came back to me like muscle memory. The effect was immediate. The hollow men stopped advancing and began backing away. The thing wearing my face snarled, and its perfect mimicry slipped for just a moment, revealing something ancient and hungry underneath. "Now!" I shouted. Tom and I ran. Behind us, the hollow men began pursuing with that same mechanical precision, but they couldn't cross the line where I'd scattered the tobacco. We had maybe a 30-second head start. We crashed through the fog-shrouded forest, branches tearing at our clothes, roots trying to trip us. The landscape kept shifting around us. Trails appeared and disappeared. Familiar landmarks moved to impossible locations. But I kept the iron charm clutched in my fist and focused on my great-grandfather's voice, remembering every story he'd told about navigating spirit-haunted ground. Stay low. Move with purpose. Don't let them see your fear. We could hear them behind us. Dozens of footsteps moving in perfect unison. Branches breaking. The sound of something large and patient hunting through the fog. Then Tom stumbled. He went down hard, his ankle twisted under him. When I helped him up, he could barely put weight on it. "Go," he said. "Get help. Come back with the state police." "I'm not leaving you." "Jerry, you have to. That thing knew about Sarah. It knew my worst fear. If it can do that..." He didn't need to finish. If the Guardian could create perfect copies of people, complete with their memories and knowledge, then it could send one of those copies back to civilization. Tom's copy could go home to his wife and daughter. My copy could return to the ranger station and continue my work, and no one would ever know the difference. Except the copies would be serving something else. Something that had been collecting souls in these mountains for 3 centuries. I heard them getting closer. The mechanical footsteps, the flat, emotionless voices calling our names. "Tom," I said, "how much ammunition do you have left?" "4 rounds." "Give me 2. I pulled out the iron railroad spike I'd found near the cave entrance, another old Cherokee tradition. Iron to pin spirits to the earth. "I'm going back." "Jerry, that's suicide." "Maybe. But if I can reach the Guardian, if I can break whatever hold he has on this place." Tom grabbed my arm. "You don't even know if that'll work. My great-grandfather's stories all ended the same way. You pin the spirit to its source and everything it controls falls apart." Tom looked at me for a long moment, then handed me 2 bullets. "You sure about this?" "No, but I'm sure about what happens if I don't try." The footsteps were getting closer. I could see shapes moving in the fog. "Get to the main trail," I told Tom. "Radio for backup. And Tom, if you see me walking out of these mountains later, shoot first and ask questions later." I turned and walked back toward the cave. The Guardian was waiting for me. He sat in the deepest part of the cave, surrounded by hundreds of artifacts spanning 3 centuries. Cherokee pottery, Confederate swords, modern camping equipment, all of it arranged in careful patterns around a natural stone throne. He looked like he might have once been a man, but centuries of unnatural life had changed him into something else. His skin was like aged leather. His eyes were white as bone, and when he moved, I could hear his joints creak like old wood. But his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of mountains. "You return to me, walker of paths. You cannot resist the call." "I'm not here to join your collection," I said, raising the iron spike. He laughed, and the sound echoed through chambers I couldn't see. "Iron and tobacco, the old protections. Your great-grandfather taught you well." "You knew him?" "I knew them all. Every Cherokee who walked these ridges for 300 years. I was their protector once, their guide between worlds, until the spirits gave me a choice: watch my people fade into history, or become eternal guardian of their sacred places." I could see the truth in his ancient eyes. This wasn't a monster. This was a man who'd made an impossible choice and been twisted by it. "The mountain spirits gave you eternal life," I said, "but they didn't tell you the price. The price was acceptable. These sacred burial grounds remain protected. The spirits of my ancestors rest undisturbed." "At the cost of how many souls? How many people have you collected over the centuries?" His face darkened. "Only those who trespass. Only those who disturb what should not be disturbed. The hunting parties weren't disturbing anything, they were just passing through. All who enter these mountains disturb the balance. All must be preserved, their knowledge added to my protection." That's when I understood. The Guardian wasn't evil. He was insane. 3 centuries of isolation and unnatural life had driven him mad. He'd forgotten that not every visitor was a threat, that some people could walk through these mountains with respect. The hollow men were starting to fill the cave entrance behind me. Tom's ankle meant he probably hadn't made it very far. Soon there would be 2 more empty shells in the Guardian's collection, unless I could end this. I raised the iron spike. "I challenge your guardianship. By Cherokee law, by the right of blood, I claim trial by combat." The Guardian's white eyes widened. "You invoke the old laws?" "My great-grandfather was Cherokee. I carry his blood and his knowledge. I have the right." For a moment the Guardian was silent. Then he stood, and I realized he was nearly 8 feet tall. "Very well, but if you lose, your friend joins the collection as well." The fight was brief but brutal. The Guardian had supernatural strength, but he was also incredibly old, and the iron spike disrupted his power. When I finally managed to drive the spike through his chest and into the stone throne behind him, he looked almost relieved. "Free," he whispered. "Finally free." The cave began to shake. Every hollow man in the forest collapsed simultaneously as their controller died. The fog lifted. The wrongness in the landscape faded away. And somewhere in the distance, I heard Tom calling my name. I found him halfway back to the main trail, still limping but alive. We made our way out of the mountains together, and by evening the Virginia State Police had recovered 8 bodies from various locations around Devil's Backbone Ridge. Official cause of death, exposure, and hypothermia. The cave with the Guardian's throne was never found again, despite multiple search attempts. I left the Ranger Service 6 months later. Couldn't explain why to Sarah or the boys, couldn't tell them about the new ability I'd developed. The ability to see hollow people walking around in everyday life. People who moved just a little too perfectly, whose eyes were just a little too empty, who might not be people at all. Because the Guardian wasn't the only one. There are others out there, in other mountains, other forests, other places where the boundary between worlds wears thin. And sometimes, late at night, I still get reports of missing hunters on Devil's Backbone Ridge. Always in groups of 8, always during fog season. The iron spike held for 50 years, but iron rusts. And some hungers are too old to die permanently. I keep the sacred tobacco close these days, just in case. Because in the mountains of Appalachia, some rangers never really retire. We just become a different kind of guardian. My name is Ruth Ann Decker, but everyone calls me Ruthie. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent the last 11 years working as a forest ranger in West Virginia. People think that's strange for a woman, especially one who grew up in coal country. But after what happened to my family in the Buffalo Creek flood back in '72, I needed to get as far from mining as possible. I lost 3 siblings that day when the coal company's dam burst. The black water swept away everything I'd ever known. So I went to college, got my master's degree in botany from WVU, and dedicated my life to protecting forests instead of destroying mountains. September 1984 found me hiking deep into the cranberry wilderness with a heavy pack and high hopes. This wasn't just any forest survey. I was tracking reports of a rare orchid species that hadn't been seen in West Virginia for over 50 years. If I could find it, document it, maybe even get some seeds, it would be the discovery of my career. The cranberry wilderness covers 47,000 acres of some of the oldest forest in America. Trees here have been growing for 300 years or more, reaching heights that make you feel like an ant. No roads run within 15 miles of where I was headed. Just me, my radio, and enough supplies for a week of serious botanical work. That morning, the forest felt different somehow. I'd been working these mountains long enough to know their moods, and something was off. The air hung too still. Birds weren't singing their usual songs. Even the insects seemed quieter than normal. I blamed it on the weird weather we'd been having. The spring had been unusually wet, causing explosive plant growth all summer long. Some trees had gained 3 feet in height, something that should take years, not months. As a scientist, I knew there had to be an explanation, probably extra nutrients in the soil from all the rain. My grandmother used to tell stories about these old forests. Witch trees, she called them, trees that could move and think and hunger for human blood. But I'd never believed mountain folklore. Plant science is based on facts, not fairy tales. The first sign something was wrong came around noon. I was examining a patch of rare ferns when I noticed the root system beneath them. The roots were far too large and complex for such small plants. More concerning, they seemed to pulse with a faint rhythmic movement, like a heartbeat. I knelt down and carefully brushed away the soil. What I found made no sense. The roots weren't just interconnected. They formed an elaborate network that stretched far beyond what should be possible. And they were moving, actually moving, contracting and expanding in slow waves. I pulled out my soil pH meter and took several readings. The numbers were impossible. Nitrogen levels were through the roof, consistent with heavily fertilized soil. But this was virgin wilderness. No one had ever farmed here or added chemicals. That's when I saw the skeleton. It was human, no doubt about it. But it wasn't lying on the ground like you'd expect from someone who died hiking. Instead, it was wrapped up in tree roots, like a Christmas present. The bones were perfectly preserved, showing no weathering or animal damage. The skull grinned up at me from its nest of pale, twisted wood. My hands shook as I reached for my radio, but before I could call it in, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Someone else was out here. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a voice I recognized. "Ruthie? That you, girl?" Dr. Kevin Morrison stepped through the trees, looking as surprised to see me as I was to see him. Kevin was a fellow botanist from the university, someone I'd worked with on several research projects. A Jeeves, good man, smart and careful in the field. "Kevin, what are you doing out here?" He adjusted his pack and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Same as you, I expect. Chasing reports of that ghost. Orchid. Thought I'd beat you to it." He grinned, then noticed my expression. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I pointed down at the skeleton wrapped in roots. Kevin's smile disappeared. "Jesus Christ. How long you think it's been here?" "That's the thing," I said. "Look at the bone condition. This should be completely decomposed after a few years in forest soil, but it looks almost fresh." Kevin knelt beside the remains, pulling out his camera. "We need to document this before we call it in. Could be archaeologically significant." As he took pictures, I noticed something else that made my stomach churn. The trees around us were moving, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. They were repositioning their branches, slowly and deliberately, like arms reaching out. "Kevin," I whispered, "look up." He followed my gaze and went pale. Above us, massive oak and maple branches were shifting position, blocking out more and more sunlight, creating shadows that seemed to creep closer to where we stood. "That's not possible," he said. But we both watched it happen. The trees were moving, and they were surrounding us. Kevin and I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The branches above us continued their slow, impossible dance, weaving together like fingers interlocking. The temperature dropped as shadows deepened around us. "There has to be an explanation," Kevin said, but his voice shook. "Wind patterns we can't feel at ground level, some kind of growth response to pressure changes." I wanted to believe him. I'd spent my whole career studying plants, understanding their behavior through science and logic. But the evidence of my eyes was impossible to ignore. "The soil samples," I said, pulling out my collection kit. "Let's test everything: pH, mineral content, nitrogen levels. If something's affecting plant growth this dramatically, it'll show up in the chemistry." We worked quickly, taking samples from around the skeleton and from areas further out. The results were consistent and disturbing. Every sample showed the same impossible nitrogen levels, the kind of readings you'd get from soil heavily fertilized with blood and bone meal. "Kevin, look at this." I showed him the pH meter. "These numbers don't make sense. It's like the entire forest floor is—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Is what?" "Like it's been feeding." That's when we heard the screaming. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, high-pitched and desperate. Human screaming, cut short too quickly. Kevin and I looked at each other, and I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. "We should help," he said, but he didn't move. "We should get out of here," I replied. The screaming came again, closer this time. Then we heard something else. A wet, sliding sound like something heavy being dragged across the forest floor. I grabbed my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Decker. I need immediate assistance at grid reference." Static. Nothing but static. I tried different frequencies, checked the batteries, adjusted the antenna. Dead air. "Mine's not working either," Kevin said, lowering his own radio. The dragging sound was getting closer, and with it came a smell, sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. "This way," I whispered, pointing toward what I hoped was the path back to my truck. But when we looked in that direction, the trees had grown closer together. Branches that had been separated by wide gaps now intertwined, creating an impassable barrier. Kevin pulled out his pocket knife and approached the nearest branch. The moment the blade touched bark, something incredible happened. The tree recoiled like a living thing, pulling back from the metal. But at the same time, vines dropped from above, wrapping around, at Kevin's wrist. He yanked his hand back with a curse. Where the vines had touched his skin, red welts were already forming. "Did you see that?" he gasped. "It moved away from the knife, but the vines, they were protecting it," I finished. "Kevin, these trees are coordinating. They're working together." The reality of our situation hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just lost in the wilderness. We were trapped by it. That's when I remembered my grandmother's stories. The witch trees that could think and move and hunger. Tales I'd dismissed as mountain superstition were playing out in front of my eyes. The dragging sound stopped directly behind us. We turned slowly, afraid of what we might see. At first, there was nothing. Just trees and shadows and the endless green of the deep forest. Then the shadows moved. Something pale and human-shaped was suspended about 10 feet off the ground, wrapped in a cocoon of vines and roots. It took me a horrible moment to realize it was moving, still alive. As we watched in frozen terror, smaller vines snaked toward the trapped figure, carrying tiny thorns that pierced the skin. The person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, twitched weakly as the thorns found their mark. "My God," Kevin whispered. "It's keeping them alive." The trees were feeding, slowly, carefully, like a spider with a fly, taking just enough blood to sustain themselves without killing their prey too quickly. I thought of the skeleton we'd found, wrapped in roots. How long had that person hung in the trees before finally dying? Days? Weeks? The trapped figure's head turned toward us with jerky, unnatural movements. When I saw the face, my knees almost gave out. It was Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher from Virginia Tech who'd gone missing in these woods 3 weeks ago. Her skin was pale as paper, covered in tiny puncture wounds. Her eyes were still aware, still human, still terrified. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. The vines around her throat tightened, cutting off the sound. Kevin started forward, but I grabbed his arm. "No, don't. Look around us." He followed my gaze and went white. While we'd been focused on Sarah, the trees had been moving. We were now completely surrounded by a wall of branches and thorns. Every direction was blocked except for a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. "They're hurting us," I said. Kevin pulled out his camera and started taking pictures of everything: the trapped woman, the moving branches, the impossible tangle of roots beneath our feet. No one will believe this without proof. A thorn-covered vine whipped through the air and slashed across his camera, destroying it in one strike. Kevin jerked his bleeding hand back and stared at the broken pieces. "I guess they don't want their picture taken," he said with shaky humor. Sarah made another weak sound, and I looked up at her again. This time I saw something that made my blood run cold. Her fingernails were turning green. The tips of her hair had a strange, plant-like texture. She wasn't just being fed upon, she was being changed. "Kevin," I whispered, "we need to move. Now." But when we looked at our only escape route, we saw more shapes hanging in the trees ahead. More cocoons. More victims in various stages of transformation. The forest was hungry, and we were next on the menu. The path ahead led deeper into darkness, where older trees waited with patient, ancient malice. Behind us, Sarah's eyes pleaded for death we couldn't give her. We had no choice but to walk forward into the green hell that was calling us home. We walked the forest's chosen path like condemned prisoners heading to execution. Every step took us deeper into the wilderness, further from any hope of rescue. The trees grew larger and older as we went, their trunks so massive that 5 people holding hands couldn't circle them. Kevin kept testing his radio every few minutes, but we both knew it was useless. The forest didn't want us calling for help. "Look at the ground," I said, pointing to the forest floor around us. The entire area was covered in a network of roots so thick they looked like veins under green skin. They pulsed with visible movement, carrying fluids from tree to tree in a vast circulatory system. Some of the roots were as thick as my arm, others thin as wire, but all of them moved with the same slow, rhythmic pulse. "It's like the whole forest is one organism," Kevin whispered. I knelt and carefully touched one of the smaller roots. It was warm and slightly damp, and the moment my finger made contact, the pulse quickened. Information was being transmitted. The forest knew exactly where we were. They're all connected, I said. Every tree, every plant, every vine. It's a single entity spread across thousands of acres. We came to a small clearing where the afternoon sun still managed to penetrate the canopy. In the center stood a structure that made my heart sink. A crude shelter built from bones and branches. Human bones. Someone else made it this far, Kevin said. I examined the construction more closely. The bones were old but well preserved, held together with dried vines and strips of bark. Inside the shelter, I found the remains of a campfire and some metal objects that had once been camping gear. Look at this, Kevin called from the other side of the clearing. He was standing next to a tree that had words carved into its bark. But the letters were filled in with what looked like dried blood, making them stand out in dark red against the gray wood. The trees are hungry, the message read. They taste your fear. Below that, in different handwriting, Sarah is still alive. Don't let them take you alive. Sarah Chen, I said. She made it this far before they caught her. Kevin touched the carved letters with his fingertip. The moment he made contact, the tree shuddered. Not a small tremor. The entire massive trunk shook like something alive had been disturbed. Don't touch them, I said. But it was too late. The tree's branches began to move about, of us repositioning themselves with increasing speed. Other trees around the clearing joined in, their branches reaching toward each other like grasping fingers. They don't like us reading the warnings, Kevin said. That's when I noticed his hand. Where he touched the carved words, red lines were spreading up his arm like infection tracks. But they weren't random. They followed the pattern of leaf veins, branching and dividing under his skin. Kevin, your arm. He looked down and went pale. What the hell? The red lines were growing longer by the second, creeping toward his shoulder. Where they passed, his skin took on a slightly green tint. It's some kind of toxin, I said, pulling out my first aid kit. When you touched the tree, it injected me with something. He sat down heavily on a fallen log. Ruthie, I can feel it moving inside me, like tiny roots growing under my skin. I didn't know what to do. My first aid training covered snake bites and broken bones, not supernatural plant poisoning. But I had to try something. Don't panic, I said, though I was fighting panic myself. Maybe if we can find the source, cut off the connection. Before I could finish the thought, the log Kevin was sitting on began to move, not rolling, growing. Branches sprouted from its sides like arms, reaching out to embrace him. Kevin jumped up, but his movements were slower than they should have been. The infection was affecting his coordination. The whole forest is alive, he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own anymore. I can feel it, Ruthie. All of it. Every tree, every root, every leaf. They're all connected. And they're all aware. His eyes were changing. The pupils were taking on an elongated shape, more like the stomata on a leaf than human eyes. Fight it, I said. Whatever's happening to you, fight it. But even as I spoke, I could see him losing the bat and left. The green tint was spreading across his skin, and when he spoke, his voice carried an odd echo, like wind through leaves. They're not evil, he said. They're just hungry. They've been hungry for so long. Kevin, listen to me. This isn't you talking. It's the infection. He tilted his head with a movement that was too fluid, too plant-like. Is it? Or am I finally understanding what I really am, what we all are? That's when I realized the terrible truth. The forest wasn't just trapping people to feed on them. It was converting them, making them part of itself. Sarah Chen, hanging in the trees, wasn't just a victim. She was becoming a component of the larger organism. How many people? I asked. How many have you taken? Kevin smiled, but it wasn't Kevin's smile anymore. Enough. We grow stronger with each addition. Soon we'll be strong enough to spread beyond these mountains. The trees around the clearing were moving faster now, their branches weaving together to form walls. But they weren't trying to trap me. They were creating a maze, directing me toward a specific destination. "Where do you want me to go?" I asked. "To the center," Kevin said. "To meet the mother. She's been waiting for you, Ruthie. She's been calling to you since you entered our territory." Against every instinct I had, I knew he was right. Something had been drawing me deeper into the forest from the moment I arrived. Not just curiosity about the rare orchid. Something deeper, more primal. "What happens if I refuse?" Kevin's laugh was the sound of wind through pine needles. "You can't refuse. None of us can. The mother calls, and we answer." The maze of branches opened before me, revealing a path that led into the darkest part of the forest, where the oldest trees waited, where something ancient and patient had been growing in power for centuries. I looked back at Kevin one last time. His transformation was nearly complete. His skin bark rough, his hair taking on the texture of moss. But somewhere in those changing eyes, I thought I saw a flicker of the man I'd known. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and for a moment his voice was purely human again. Then the moment passed, and he was lost to me forever. I walked into the maze, following the path the forest had chosen. Behind me, Kevin's new body took root in the soil, becoming another guardian of the mother's domain. Ahead lay the heart of the entity that called itself forest, and the answers to questions I was no longer sure I wanted to ask. The path led me through trees so old they remembered when the first Europeans set foot in these mountains. Their trunks were scarred with centuries of growth, twisted into impossible shapes that hurt to look at directly. The air grew thicker as I walked, heavy with the smell of rich earth and decay. Kevin followed behind me, no longer entirely human, but not yet fully plant. He moved with a swaying motion, like a sapling in the breeze, and when he spoke, it was with the voice of the forest itself. "She's close now," he said. "The mother. She's been here since before your people came to these mountains, since before the Cherokee. She remembers when this land was young. What does she want with me? You'll understand soon enough." The trees ahead were different from any I'd seen. They grew in a perfect circle around something I couldn't yet see. Their branches so intertwined they formed a living cathedral. As we approached, the trees parted like curtains, revealing the horror within. At the center of the circle stood the mother. She was a tree, but not like any tree that should exist. Her trunk was easily 20 feet across, covered in bark that rippled and moved like skin. Human faces pushed out from the bark, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some were fresh and still recognizable as individuals. Others had been absorbed so long ago they were just suggestions of features in the wood. But the worst part was that some of the faces were still alive, that her eyes tracked my movement. Their mouths opened and closed soundlessly, trying to speak or scream. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Kevin said, and his voice was full of worship. Roots spread out, from the mother's base like arteries, connecting her to every tree in the forest. They pulsed with the same rhythm I'd been seeing all day, pumping nutrients and information through the vast network. I understood now that everything, every plant, every vine, every blade of grass, was just an extension of this single, ancient consciousness. "How long has she been here?" I asked. 500 years, Kevin answered, but the words came from several voices at once. Looking around, I saw that other partially transformed people stood at the edges of the clearing. Park visitors, researchers, hikers, all in various stages of being absorbed into the forest entity. "We were the Cherokee medicine man who first awakened her," said a figure I recognized as a missing archaeologist from 3 years ago. Half his body had turned to bark, but his mouth still worked. "We performed a ritual to protect the land from the white settlers, but we got more than we bargained for." "She was supposed to defend the forest," added another voice. "Instead, she became it." The mother's attention turned to me then, and I felt her consciousness press against my mind like a physical weight. Images flooded my thoughts. Centuries of forest growth, the slow absorption of countless victims, the patient expansion of her influence. But also Loneliness. Incredible, aching loneliness. You understand, Kevin said, reading my expression. She's been alone for so long. The only way she can connect with others is to make them part of herself. By killing them. By saving them. Look around you, Ruthie. We're all still here, still conscious, still part of something greater than ourselves. I wanted to argue, but part of me could feel the pull of what he was offering. To be part of something vast and eternal, connected to every living thing in the forest. To never be alone again. My hand moved toward the moth. There's trunk without conscious thought. That's it, Kevin encouraged. Just touch her, let her in. But as my fingers neared the bark, I caught sight of one of the faces trapped there. It was Sarah Chen, her features still distinct, though partially absorbed. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw not peace or transcendence, but pure terror. She was still herself in there, still trapped, still suffering. I jerked my hand back. No. Kevin's expression changed, becoming predatory. You don't have a choice. The partially transformed figures around the clearing began to move toward me. Behind them, vines and branches descended from above, cutting off any hope of escape. Everyone chooses eventually, said the archaeologist. The mother is patient. She can wait. But I remembered something Kevin had said earlier, when he was still mostly human. The forest was hungry, but it had weaknesses. It needed specific conditions to thrive, the right soil, the right nutrients, the right fungal networks. What happens if the soil changes, I asked. What if the fungal connections are broken? Kevin's eyes widened. You can't. You don't understand what you'd be destroying. I understand perfectly. I pulled out a small bottle from my pack, industrial herbicide I'd brought for sampling invasive species. Concentrated enough to kill plants on contact, designed to disrupt the mycorrhizal networks that trees depended on for communication and nutrients. One tree, even a big one like this, I couldn't hurt, I said. But if I can break the connections... Don't! Kevin lunged toward me, but his plant hybrid body was too slow. I uncapped the bottle and poured the entire contents onto the largest root cluster. The effect was immediate and devastating. The mother's scream echoed through my mind like breaking glass. Every tree in the forest shuddered at once, their branches thrashing wildly. The faces in the mother's bark contorted in agony as the poison spread through the network. You're killing us, Kevin cried, his voice breaking apart into whispers and wind sounds. I'm freeing you. The herbicide spread through the root system like wildfire, severing connections that had existed for centuries. One by one, the transformed people around the clearing began to collapse as the forest's hold on them weakened. Some of them looked grateful as they fell. The mother's trunk began to crack and split, releasing the imprisoned faces. Most crumbled to dust the moment they were freed. They'd been dead for decades or centuries, but a few of the more recent victims took gasping breaths, suddenly human again. Sarah Chen fell from the tree, weak but alive. Kevin was changing too, the green fading from his skin as the plant toxins left his system. But the transformation had gone too far. Without the forest's supernatural sustenance, his body began to fail. Ruthie, he whispered, reaching out with a hand that was human again. I'm sorry. I tried to fight it, but she was so lonely. I know, I said, taking his hand. You did your best. Around us, the forest was dying. Not just the mother, but every tree connected to her network. 500 years of supernatural growth was collapsing in a matter of minutes. Kevin died in my arms as the last of the plant toxins left his system. He looked peaceful at the end, himself again, free from the mother's influence. The great tree gave one final, terrible groan and toppled, taking down several smaller trees as it fell. The impact shook the ground like an earthquake. In the sudden silence that followed, I could hear something I hadn't heard all day. Normal forest sounds, birds singing, insects buzzing, the sound of a natural woods returning to life. But even as I helped Sarah to her feet, I knew this wasn't over. Spores from the fungal network were already drifting on the wind, carrying the potential for the mother's rebirth to new forests. I'd won a battle, but the war was just beginning. Sarah and I made it out of the forest just as the sun was setting. By the time the rescue teams arrived, 47,000 acres of ancient woodland had died, creating a dead zone that could be seen from space. The official report blamed an accidental herbicide spill during a research expedition. The EPA quarantined the entire area indefinitely, citing concerns about soil contamination and ecosystem damage. No one mentioned the supernatural aspects of what really happened. They couldn't. Who would believe it? Sarah recovered physically, but she never talked about her 3 weeks in the trees. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at her hands, checking to make sure her fingernails weren't turning green. We had an understanding. Some experiences are too terrible to share, even with people who lived through them. The forest grew back, of course. Nature abhors a vacuum, and within 2 years, new growth was sprouting from the poisoned soil. But it was different now. Normal. The trees grew at natural rates, responded to wind and weather like trees should, and showed no signs of supernatural awareness. For a while, I thought it was over. I had to leave Forest Service work after the incident. Developed severe allergies to almost every species of plant, making it impossible to spend time in woodland environments. The doctors called it a stress reaction, but I knew better. My body was rejecting anything that might carry spores from the mother's network. I moved to Denver, got a job with the EPA monitoring industrial pollution. Concrete and steel felt safe after what I'd experienced in the green hell of West Virginia. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream of the faces in the bark. And sometimes, when I'm not careful about checking my sources, I'll read a news report that makes my blood run cold. Unusual plant behavior reported in Oregon National Forest. Hikers missing in unusual circumstances near Yellowstone. Botanical researchers discover unprecedented root network complexity in Minnesota wilderness. The spores traveled farther than I thought possible. Or maybe there were always other nodes of the network, sleeping until their time came. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes I have to act. That's why I'm writing this down. Not as an official report. No government agency would take it seriously. But as a warning for other researchers, other botanists who might encounter the same impossible growth patterns I found in the cranberry wilderness. If you're reading this and you work in forest environments, watch for these signs: trees growing too fast, soil with impossible nitrogen levels, root networks that pulse with visible fluid movement. If you see any of these things, get out immediately. Don't try to study it, don't try to document it, don't try to understand it. Just run. And if you can't run, if the trees have already started moving to block your path, remember this: they need the fungal networks to maintain control. Industrial herbicide, concentrated and applied directly to the largest root clusters, can break the connections. It will destroy the forest, but it might save your life and the lives of everyone the entity might claim in the future. I've spent the last 3 years quietly distributing information through scientific networks disguised as warnings about aggressive invasive species. A few researchers have contacted me privately, sharing stories that confirm my worst fears. The mother may be gone, but her children are waking up. Last week, I got a call from a botanist in Oregon. She'd found a grove of trees that seemed to be communicating with each other, coordinating their growth in impossible ways. She wanted to bring in a full research team. I told her about industrial herbicide, about the importance of breaking fungal networks before they mature, about the choice between preserving wilderness and preserving human life. She thought I was crazy at first, but she promised to be careful, to watch for the warning signs I described. I hope that's enough. I hope she listens. Because somewhere out there in forests I'll never see, the hunger is growing again. Patient and ancient and eternally lonely, reaching out through root and spore and secret underground networks, looking for new victims to join its endless communion. The trees are always hungry, and they remember the taste of human blood. My name is Franklin McMurray, though most folks just call me Frank. I've been a park ranger here in the Great Smoky Mountains for 14 years now, and before that, my family's been calling these hills home since the 1790s. My great-great-grandfather was one of the first settlers to put down roots in Cades Cove. back when it was nothing but wilderness and Cherokee hunting grounds. That summer of 1976 was special. The whole country was celebrating the bicentennial, and we were getting more visitors than we'd ever seen before. Everyone wanted to see where America really began. The old log cabins, the churches, the mills that our ancestors built with their bare hands. I was proud to show them around. This was my history, my blood, my mountain. Cades Cove sits in a natural bowl surrounded by peaks that reach up 6,000 feet. It's like God scooped out a perfect valley and dropped it right in the heart of the Smokies. The 11-mile loop road takes tourists past all the historic sites, the John Oliver cabin, the primitive Baptist church, the old grist mill that still turns when the creek runs high. Most days I'd drive that loop 3 or 4 times, checking on things, talking to visitors, making sure nobody wandered off the marked trails. The Park Service had spent years fixing up those old buildings, making them safe for tourists while keeping them authentic. It was my job to protect both the history and the people who came to see it. But something felt different that July. Maybe it was the fog. We always get morning mist in the cove. It's natural the way the cool mountain air settles in the valley. But that summer, the fog was staying longer, thicker. Some mornings you couldn't see the cabins from the road, even with the sun well up. The first odd report came from the Henderson family from Ohio. They were nice folks, parents with 2 young kids, maybe Ada, and 10 years old. They'd stopped at the Elijah Oliver cabin, one of the nicer preserved homesteads, to take some pictures. "Ranger," Mrs. Henderson said, pulling me aside while her husband helped the kids back into their station wagon. There were children watching us from the cabin windows. When we got closer to take a look, they just disappeared. I smiled and nodded. Probably local kids playing around. They know these old places better than we do sometimes. But something in her voice bothered me. She sounded scared, not annoyed, and she kept looking back at the cabin like she expected something to appear in those dark window frames. That afternoon, I walked around the Oliver place myself. It's a 2-story log cabin with a shake roof, built around 1850. The windows are just openings. No glass, of course. Inside, we've got period furniture and tools, all roped off to keep visitors from touching. I didn't see any children, but I did notice something strange. The dust on the windowsills was disturbed, like someone had been leaning against them. And there were smudges on the logs below the windows, about the right height for kids to leave handprints. I made a note to increase patrols around the historic buildings. July was peak season, and we couldn't have local kids causing problems for the tourists. The Park Service took visitor experience seriously, especially during the bicentennial summer. Walking back to my truck, I stopped by the old cemetery behind the cabin. Most people don't notice it, just a few weathered stones among the weeds and saplings. But I always check on it. Some of those graves hold my own family members, going back 5 generations. The fog was starting to roll in again, even though it was past 4 in the afternoon. That wasn't normal. Summer fog in the mountains usually burns off by noon, but this was different, thicker, almost solid low, oaking as it crept between the trees. Standing there among those old graves, watching the fog swallow up the forest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in all my years in these mountains. Something was watching me. Not the casual attention of a deer or bear, but the focused stare of something that understood what it was looking at. I turned around slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just the fog getting thicker and the shadows getting longer. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. By the time I reached my truck, the fog had covered everything. I could barely see the road, much less the cabin. I'd driven that loop thousands of times, but that evening I drove it slower than usual, my headlights barely cutting through the gray wall that surrounded me. Something was different in Cades Cove. I didn't know what yet, but 40 years of mountain living had taught me to trust my instincts. And my instincts were telling me that the Henderson family hadn't seen local kids playing pranks. They'd seen something else entirely. The next morning brought 3 more reports of children around the historic cabins. All different families, all describing the same thing. Kids watching them from windows or doorways, then vanishing when approached. But the details they gave me started to paint a picture that made my skin crawl. Their heads seemed too big, said Mr. Peterson from Georgia, and they were so pale, like they'd never seen sunlight. Mrs. Williams from North Carolina was more specific. 5 children, all different ages, but they moved together, like a pack. And their eyes, Lord, their eyes were completely black. I spent that morning walking around every historic building in the cove, looking for signs. What I found made me wish the tourists were just imagining things. Behind the John Oliver cabin, I discovered footprints in the soft earth near the spring. They were definitely made by children, small, barefoot impressions in the mud. But they were wrong somehow, too wide, with what looked like extra toes. And they were deep, like children who made them were heavier than they should be. I took photographs and made plaster casts, following procedures I'd learned in ranger training. But even as I worked, I kept looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, more focused. Something was definitely out there, studying me as carefully as I was studying its tracks. That afternoon, a family from Tennessee had a closer encounter. The Martins were visiting the cantilever barn, a unique structure built without nails, held together by interlocking wooden beams. Their 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, had wandered around to the back of the barn while her parents read the historical marker. "Mama!" she screamed and came running back around the corner, face white with terror. Mrs. Martin grabbed her daughter while Mr. Martin rushed to see what had frightened her. By the time I got there, they were all back at their car, engine running. "There were 6 of them," Sarah whispered, still shaking. 6 children, all staring at me. But they weren't right. Their skin was like paper, and they had no hair. And when I yelled, they just smiled. They had too many teeth. Mr. Martin had seen them too, just for a second before they melted back into the shadows of the barn. "Ranger, I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years. I know what children look like. Those weren't children, not human children." I tried to calm them down, offered the usual explanations about local kids and tricks of light. But I didn't believe it myself anymore. I walked around that barn 3 times, finding more of those strange footprints, and something else that made my blood run cold. Carved into one of the barn's support beams, about 4 feet off the ground, were symbols, not words, not letters, but deliberate markings that looked almost like letters, but weren't from any alphabet I recognized. And they were fresh. The wood was still light where someone had cut into it. I took more photographs, but when I developed them later, the symbols came out blurred and unclear, like something had interfered with the camera. The footprint photos were fine, sharp, and detailed, but every shot of those markings was useless. That evening I decided to stay late and patrol the cove after closing time. Most tourists were gone by sunset, and I figured whatever was happening would be easier to observe without crowds around. I parked near the Methodist church and walked the grounds as darkness settled over the valley. The fog was rolling in again, thicker than ever. By 9 o'clock, I could barely see 20 feet in any direction. That's when I heard them. Children's voices, soft and distant, singing something that might have been a hymn. The melody was familiar, something from the old mountain churches. But the words were wrong. Not English, not Cherokee, but something else entirely. I followed the sound toward the primitive Baptist church, my flashlight beam swallowed by the fog. The singing got clearer as I approached, and I realized there were at least a dozen voices, maybe more. The church door was standing open. I'd locked that door myself before leaving earlier. I had the only key, and it was still in my pocket. But there it was, hanging wide on its leather hinges, and the singing was coming from inside. I stepped up to the doorway and shined my light into the church. The beam cut through the fog and illuminated the old wooden pews, the simple pulpit, the rough-hewn walls. Everything looked normal, except for the children. They filled the front pews, maybe 15 or 20 of them, ranging in age from what looked like 5 to 15 years old. They were all pale, almost translucent, with thin white hair and those completely black eyes the tourists had described. Their heads were definitely too large for their bodies, and their limbs seemed too long. But they were singing, clear as anything, in perfect harmony. And they were looking right at me, the singing on. G stopped. For a moment that seemed to last forever, we just stared at each other, I wanted to run, wanted to call for backup, wanted to do anything except stand there in that doorway. But I couldn't move. Those black eyes held me like chains. Then the largest child, a boy who might have been 14, stood up and walked toward me. He moved wrong, too fluid, like his joints bent in ways human joints shouldn't. When he got close enough, he spoke. "You're Frank McMurray." His voice was clear but strange, like he was speaking through water. "Your people built this place." I found my voice somehow. "Who are you? Where are your parents?" He smiled, showing too many teeth, all of them pointed. "We are the mountain's children. We have always been here. Your people knew us before they forgot." "I don't understand." "You will." He tilted his oversized head. "We need new blood, Frank McMurray. The old blood is getting thin." Before I could ask what he meant, the fog suddenly thickened, becoming solid as a wall. My flashlight beam couldn't penetrate it at all. When it cleared, maybe 30 seconds later, the church was empty. But carved into the wooden door frame, right at eye level, was a fresh symbol. The same kind I'd found on the barn, but deeper, more deliberate. It looked almost like a warning. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with every book on local history I owned, searching for any mention of strange children in Cades Cove. What I found in a 1923 county survey made my hands shake. Several families in the isolated Cades Cove settlement report encounters with peculiar children of unknown parentage. These children appear malnourished and exhibit unusual physical characteristics. Local residents suggest they may be offspring of families who retreated deep into the mountains to avoid outside contact. Investigation pending. There was no follow up report. The survey ended there, right before the government started buying up the land to create the national park. The next morning brought chaos. Word had spread somehow, maybe through the tourists who'd seen the children, and we had reporters showing up from Knoxville and Chattanooga. I spent 3 hours giving interviews, trying to downplay everything as misidentified local kids and tourist imagination. But the encounters were getting worse. Around noon, the Caldwell family from Virginia was touring the cable mill area when their 6-year-old son, Tommy, wandered off toward the mill pond. They found him 10 minutes later, standing waist-deep in the water, staring at something beneath the surface. "Tommy!" his mother called. "Get out of there right now!" But Tommy didn't move. He just kept staring down into the dark water, like he was hypnotized. His father waded in to get him, and that's when they saw what Tommy was looking at. Faces in the water, pale children's faces, looking up from the bottom of the pond. Not reflections, not tricks of light. Actual faces, with black eyes and 2 wide smiles, maybe 8 feet underwater. Mr. Caldwell grabbed Tommy and hauled him to shore, but the boy fought him every step of the way. Tommy kept reaching back toward the water, calling to the faces below in words his parents had never heard him speak before. "They were teaching me songs," Tommy said later, when the family stopped by the visitor center to report what happened. "Pretty songs about the deep places in the old blood." By the time I got to the mill pond, there was nothing to see except disturbed mud on the bottom. But I talked to Tommy while his parents filled out an incident report, and what he told me chilled me to the bone. "The pale children live under the water sometimes," he said matter-of-factly, "but mostly they live in the dark places in the mountain. They've been waiting a long time for new friends." "What kind of new friends, Tommy?" "Kids like me. Kids who can learn the songs and play the games and help make the blood strong again." His parents heard that last part and decided they'd had enough of Cades Cove. They packed up and left within the hour. But Tommy's words stuck with me. Make the blood strong again. That was almost exactly what the boy in the church had said about needing new blood. That afternoon, I made a decision that probably broke every Park Service regulation in the book. I drove to the end of the loop road, past the designated hiking trails, and headed up an old logging road that most people didn't even know existed. If these children had parents, if there was some isolated family living in the backcountry, I needed to find them. The logging road petered out after about 3 miles, but I kept going on foot, following game trails and creek beds deeper into the mountains. This was country I'd hunted and hiked since I was a boy, but it felt different now. Wrong, somehow. The trees were too quiet, and the shadows were too dark for the middle of the day. I found the first cave around 4 o'clock. It was hidden behind a waterfall, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult, but it went back into the mountain farther than my flashlight could reach. And there were fresh footprints in the mud outside. Lots of them. Children's prints, all showing those same wrong proportions I'd seen before. I called into the cave, identifying myself as a park ranger, asking if anyone needed help. The only answer was an echo that seemed to go on too long. But as I started to turn away, I heard something that made me freeze. Singing, very faint, coming from deep inside the mountain. The same melody I'd heard in the church, but with more voices now, many more. I should have left then, should have hiked back to my truck and called for backup. Instead, I squeezed through that cave opening and followed the sound into the mountain. The cave wubbers, as bigger inside than it looked, opening up into chambers that had to be natural formations. But someone had lived here for a long time. The walls were carved with symbols like the ones I'd found on the barn and church. And there were artifacts, crude furniture, metal tools, scraps of cloth that looked handmade. The singing was getting louder, coming from somewhere ahead. I followed a narrow passage that sloped downward, my flashlight beam dancing off wet stone walls. The air was getting warmer as I went deeper, and there was a smell I couldn't identify, sweet but wrong, like flowers left too long in water. The passage opened into a huge chamber, maybe 60 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. And it wasn't empty. They were everywhere. Children and adults, maybe 40 or 50 people total, all with that same pale skin and black eyes. Some looked almost normal, just thin and underfed. Others were clearly deformed, twisted limbs, enlarged heads, features that didn't belong on human faces. They were sitting in circles around small fires, and they were all looking at me. The singing stopped. An old woman stood up from the nearest circle. She was ancient, bent with age, but her black eyes were sharp and alert. When she spoke, her voice carried easily across the chamber. "Franklin McMurray, we have been waiting for you." "Who are you people? How do you know my name?" She smiled, showing gums with only a few scattered teeth. "We are the ones who stayed, boy. When the government men came to take our valley, some of us refused to leave. We came to the deep places, to the old places your people forgot. That was 50 years ago. You'd have to be. Time moves differently in the deep places, and we learned to live long, to make the blood last." She gestured to the deformed people around the fires. "But the blood grows weak when it only mixes with itself. We need fresh blood, young blood. The children, the ones appearing to tourists, our scouts, our gatherers, they look for suitable additions to our family." "You're talking about Kat, napping." Her smile widened. "We are talking about survival. Your great-great-grandfather understood. He gave us 2 of his children when the blood grew thin before." "That's impossible. My family—" "Your family has always known about us, boy. Check your records. Check the old graves. Some of your kin never left these mountains." I wanted to argue, to deny what she was saying, but I was remembering family stories, old tales about children who wandered off and were never found, deaths that seemed suspicious, graves with no dates. "The tourist child from this morning," I said. "Tommy Caldwell. What did you do to him?" "Nothing yet, but he heard the songs. He will remember them, and when the time is right, he will come back to us. They always do. I won't let you hurt anyone." The old woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You cannot stop what has already begun, Franklin McMurray. The mountain's children must survive, and you will help us." Before I could ask what she meant, the fires around the chamber suddenly went out, plunging everything into absolute darkness. I heard movement, lots of it, and voices whispering in that strange language I'd heard in the church. My flashlight died. In the darkness, something grabbed my arm, Small hands, but incredibly strong. More hands seized my other arm, my legs, my shoulders. I was being dragged deeper into the cave system, away from the entrance, away from any hope of escape. And all around me, the children were singing again, singing about new blood and old promises in the deep places where time moved like honey. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the old woman's voice following me into the depths. "Welcome to the family, boy. Welcome home." I woke up in a smaller chamber, my hands and feet tied with what felt like strips of leather. My head was pounding, and my mouth tasted like I'd been drugged. How long had I been unconscious? Hours? Days? A small fire burned in the center of the room, giving just enough light to see by. And sitting across from me, watching me with those terrible black eyes, was the boy from the church. "You're awake," he said. "Good. Mother wants to talk to you. Let me go. People will be looking for me." He tilted his oversized head. "No one looks for the lost in these mountains, Frank McMurray. Too many places to disappear. Too many ways to never be found." The old woman entered the chamber, moving with surprising grace for someone her age. Behind her came two of the deformed adults, their bodies twisted, but their movements coordinated. They positioned themselves on either side of me. "I have been thinking about our conversation," she said, settling herself on a rough stone seat. "About your family's connection to ours. Would you like to hear the true history of Cades Cove?" "I know the history. My ancestors, your ancestors made a deal." Her voice cut through mine like a knife. In 1847, when the crops failed and the winter was hard, when children were dying of hunger and disease, they came to us, to the old families who knew the secret ways. She gestured to the walls around us, covered in those carved symbols. We taught them to live in the deep places when times were hard. We shared our knowledge of the plants that heal, the waters that strengthen, the songs that keep the darkness away. And in return, they gave us what we needed. Fresh blood, young bodies, children who could carry both bloodlines forward. I struggled against the leather bonds, but they were too tight. "You're lying. My family wouldn't." "Your great-great-grandfather, Duncan McMurray, gave us his youngest daughter, Molly. She was 7 years old, sickly, likely to die anyway. But down here in the deep places she lived, she thrived. She became the mother of many of our current generation." The boy leaned forward. "That makes us cousins, Frank. And your great-grandfather, Robert McMurray, sent us his twin sons. And they were born wrong. Joined at the hip they were. The doctors in town said they couldn't be separated, would die within the year. But we knew how to care for such children. They lived to be 40, and their children carry the strongest blood we have." I was remembering family stories now, fragments of conversations I'd overheard as a child, whispered tales about relatives who'd gone to live with the mountain people. I'd always thought they were just euphemisms for mental illness or physical deformity. "The deal continued for generations," the old woman said. "When your people prospered, they forgot us. But when times were hard, when children were born different, or families faced starvation, they remembered the old agreement. But that ended when the park was created. Yes, the government forced most of your people to leave, but some of us refused to go. We retreated deeper, lived in places the surveys never found. And we waited." She stood up, moving closer to me. "But the blood has grown thin, Frank. Too much intermarriage, too many generations with the same families. We need fresh genetic material, or we will not survive another generation. That's why the children are appearing to tourists. We have been watching, testing, selecting, looking for families with young children who might not be missed immediately, or children who might be receptive to our influence. Like Tommy Caldwell." The boy heard the songs clearly. "His bloodline is compatible. He will make a fine addition to our family." I pulled harder against the bonds. "I won't let you take him. You cannot stop us. But you can help us choose more carefully. You know every family that visits the cove. You could guide us to the right children, the ones who would benefit from joining us. You want me to help you kidnap children. I want you to help us survive, and in return, we will make you one of us. You will live long, Frank McMurray, longer than you can imagine. You will see generations come and go. You will watch the mountains change and endure. She nodded to the deformed adults, and they began untying my bonds. But instead of freedom, I felt small hands grabbing my arms. 3 children had entered the chamber, all with that pale skin and black eyes. The transformation begins with the songs, the old woman said. Then the waters, then the joining of blood. It will hurt, but you will emerge stronger. The children began to sing, and I felt something changing in my head. The melody was hypnotic, compelling, making it hard to think clearly. I could feel my resistance weakening, my will dissolving. But then I heard something else. Voices calling my name echoing through the cave system. Search and rescue teams, maybe state police. Someone had noticed I was missing. The old woman heard it too. Her face twisted with rage. Impossible. No one comes to the deep places uninvited. Frank McMurray, can you hear us? The voices were getting closer, and I could see light now. Real electric light, not the flickering glow of fires. You brought them here, the old woman hissed. You led them to us. I didn't. But she wasn't listening. She was giving orders in that strange language, and suddenly the chamber was full of movement. Adults and children scrambling in all directions, grabbing possessions, extinguishing fires. Kill him, she ordered the deformed adults. Kill him and scatter. We will find another valley, another place to hide. The nearest adult raised a crude knife, its blade gleaming in the dying firelight. But before he could strike, the boy from the church grabbed his arm. No, the boy said. He is family. Blood calls to blood. He has betrayed us. He has led help to us, as family should. That is his choice to make. The argument continued in their strange language, while the search voices got closer. I used the distraction to roll away from the fire, toward what looked like another passage out of the chamber. Frank, see coming. The old woman made a decision. Leave him. But remember this, Franklin McMurray. The mountain's children do not forget. We will find another place, and we will endure. And someday, when you are old and weak, we will come for what you owe us. She and the others melted into the darkness, leaving me alone in the dying light of the fire. Minutes later, the search team found me, confused and dehydrated, but alive. The official report listed my disappearance as a hiking accident. I'd gotten lost in the cave system, suffered mild hypothermia and hallucinations from dehydration. The Park Service was satisfied with that explanation, and I didn't offer any alternatives. But I couldn't forget what I'd seen down there. And more importantly, I couldn't ignore what the old woman had told me about my family history. I spent weeks in the county records office, going through old documents, birth certificates, death records. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Children had disappeared from my family over the generations. Not many, but enough to establish a pattern, and always during hard times when families were struggling to survive. The tourist encounters stopped after my rescue. No more sightings of pale children around the historic buildings. No more reports of strange behavior or missing kids. It was like the mountain's children had vanished completely. But I knew better. They were still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Smokies, watching, waiting, planning their next move. I tried to put it behind me to focus on my regular duties, but 3 months later, I got a phone call that made my blood run cold. Ranger McMurray, this is Detective Phillips with the Tennessee State Police. We have a situation in Sevier County that might interest you. A family had been camping near Cataract Falls, about 20 miles from Cades Cove. Their 10-year-old daughter had wandered off during the night. When they found her the next morning, she was standing in the middle of the creek, singing in a language no one recognized. The girl keeps asking, "About the pale children," Detective Phillips said. "Says they've been teaching her songs. Her parents are frantic." I knew immediately what had happened. The mountain's children had found a new location, a new hunting ground. and they were starting over, looking for children to add to their dwindling numbers. "I'll be right there," I told the detective. As I drove toward Sevier County, I made a decision that would define the rest of my career. I couldn't stop the mountain's children. They'd been surviving in these hills for too long, knew too many secrets. But I could protect the families who visited our parks. I started keeping detailed records of every unusual report, every strange encounter, every child who showed signs of the mountain's children's influence. I developed protocols for handling these situations, ways to intervene before families were torn apart. Over the years, I encountered them dozens of times, always in remote areas, always near water or caves. They adapted, learned to avoid detection, but they never stopped looking for new blood to strengthen their failing lineage. I never saw the old woman again, but I often spotted the boy from the church. He seemed to age very slowly, still looking like a teenager even after 20 years. Sometimes he would watch me from the tree line while I worked, and once, just once, he approached me directly. "You could have been one of us," he said sadly. "You could have lived forever in the deep places." "Some prices are too high," I replied. He nodded, understanding. "The offer remains open, cousin. When your time comes, when your body fails, remember that the mountain's children do not die as others do." Then he was gone, melted back into the forest like smoke. I retired from the Park Service in 1998, after 36 years of protecting these mountains and the people who visit them. But retirement didn't end my responsibility. I still get calls from current rangers, reports of strange encounters that match the old patterns. The mountain's children are still out there, still watching, still waiting for the right opportunity to add to their numbers. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls thick through Cades Cove, I can hear them singing their ancient songs. Songs about blood and survival and the deep places where time moves differently. Songs that still call to something in my McMurray blood, no matter how hard I try to forget. They're my family, after all, and family never really lets you go. The mountain remembers everything, and the mountain's children have very long memories indeed. My name is Catherine Branham, though everyone at the Red River Gorge calls me Kate. I've been a park ranger here in Kentucky for 12 years, and before that I spent another decade as a geologist for coal companies. That's a chapter of my life I try not to think about much anymore. All those mountains we stripped bare, all those streams we poisoned with runoff. Some mistakes follow you forever. These days, I protect what's left instead of destroying it. The Red River Gorge is 29,000 acres of sandstone cliffs, natural arches, and some of the most beautiful cave systems you'll ever see. It's my job to keep them safe, and I take that job seriously. October in Kentucky is something special. The leaves turn every shade of red and gold you can imagine, and the tourists come in droves to see it all. This particular October in 1989 was busier than usual. The weather had been perfect. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, clear skies that went on forever. We were issuing more cave exploration permits than I'd seen in years. That's why I was out there that Tuesday morning checking safety equipment and rope systems in the main cave entrance near Natural Bridge. I'd been doing routine inspections when I felt it, a tremor that ran through the rock beneath my feet. Nothing major, just a little shake that lasted maybe 3 seconds. We'd been having small earthquakes all month. Nothing dangerous, but enough to change things underground. I was coiling up climbing rope when I heard something strange. A sound coming from deep in the cave system, like singing almost, but not quite human. More like wind through a pipe organ, but with a melody that seemed to shift and change. I'd worked these caves for over a decade. I knew every echo, every sound the wind made when it moved through the passages. This was different. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe some tourists had wandered off the marked trails. My voice bounced back to me, but underneath it, that singing continued, faint but persistent. I grabbed my headlamp and flashlight and headed deeper into the cave. The main passage stretched ahead of me, familiar as my own backyard. Limestone walls curved up into darkness, and my boots crunched on the gravelly floor. The singing got a little louder as I walked. About 200 yards in, I stopped. The sound wasn't coming from ahead of me anymore. It was coming from above and to my left, where I knew there was nothing but solid rock. I'd surveyed this section myself 3 years ago. There were no side passages here, no chambers or rooms, just the main tunnel that led deeper into the mountain. But earthquakes can change things. They can open new cracks, reveal hidden spaces that have been sealed for centuries. I ran my hands along the left wall, feeling for any irregularities. About 8 feet up, my fingers found something, a gap in the rock, maybe 2 feet wide and just tall enough for a person to squeeze through, a passage that definitely hadn't been there before. The singing was coming from inside. I should have gone back, should have reported the new opening, brought a team to explore it safely. That's protocol. But 12 years of cave rescue work had taught me that sometimes you don't have time for protocol. Sometimes people are in trouble and need help right away. So I found handholds in the limestone and pulled myself up to the gap. My headlamp beam disappeared into a passage that curved away into darkness. The singing was clearer now, definitely musical, with harmonies and rhythms that seemed almost like a conversation. I squeezed through the opening and found myself in a tunnel I'd never seen before. The walls were different here, covered in some kind of crystalline formations that caught my light and threw it back in rainbow patterns. The singing surrounded me now, coming from everywhere at once. The tunnel opened into a chamber about the size of a small church, and that's when I saw them. The walls were covered in crystals unlike anything I'd ever encountered in 20-plus years of geology work. They hung in clusters and formations, some clear as glass, others clouded with what looked like trapped smoke. They were singing. Actually singing. As I stood there with my mouth hanging open, the crystals pulsed with soft light and produced pure, bell-like tones. Different formations sang in different keys, and together they created music that was beautiful and completely impossible. I'm a scientist. I believe in things that can be measured and explained. Rock formations don't sing, they don't glow, they don't create melodies that sound like they've been composed by someone who understood music better than any human ever could. But they were doing it anyway. I stood in that chamber for maybe 10 minutes, just listening. The music shifted and changed, sometimes sounding like voices having a conversation in a language I didn't recognize, other times like a choir singing hymns I'd never heard but somehow felt familiar with. My radio crackled with static, and I remembered I should check in with the ranger station. But when I tried to use it, all I got was more static mixed with what sounded like the crystal music. My compass spun wildly, and my digital watch had stopped working entirely. I decided to document what I was seeing. I had a camera with me, one of those new instant cameras that tourists like to use. I took a few pictures of the formations, trying to capture the way they glowed and pulsed. The camera flash seemed to excite the crystals. The singing got louder, more complex, and new formations that I hadn't noticed before began to light up along the far wall. It was like they were responding to me. I walked closer to examine the crystals up close. That's when I saw the artifacts. Scattered around the base of the crystal formations were objects that clearly didn't belong. Staying in a newly opened cave chamber. Pottery shards decorated with patterns I recognized from Cherokee artifacts in the park's museum. Stone tools. Pieces of what looked like ceremonial clothing preserved by the constant temperature and humidity of the cave. This place had been used before, for a long time by the look of it. I picked up one of the pottery pieces, and the crystal singing changed instantly. It became softer, more melodic, and I could swear I heard voices in it. Actual human voices, speaking in what might have been Cherokee. The words were unclear, but the tone was reverent, like prayers or chants. That's when I remembered the stories. Old-timers around the gorge, especially the Cherokee families who still lived in the area, sometimes talked about singing stones, rocks that could remember voices and play them back, formations that could warn people about danger or guide them to safety. I'd always figured they were just folklore, stories to explain the weird acoustics you sometimes get in limestone caves. Now I wasn't so sure. I spent another hour in the chamber, taking notes and trying to understand what I was seeing. The crystals seemed to respond to my presence, growing brighter when I moved closer, dimming when I stepped away. When I spoke, they seemed to listen, and sometimes they'd repeat back sounds that were almost like echoes of my voice, but not quite. Finally, I decided I needed to get back to the surface and report what I'd found. I made my way back through the tunnel and down to the main cave passage. As soon as I was away from the crystals, my equipment started working normally again. Back at the ranger station, I filed my report carefully. New chamber discovered due to recent seismic activity. Interesting geological formations requiring further study. I didn't mention the singing or the way the crystals had seemed to respond to me. That could. I'd wait until I had a better understanding of what was happening. But I couldn't stop thinking about those voices I'd heard in the crystal music. They'd sounded real. Not like echoes or acoustic tricks, but like actual people talking and singing in that chamber, maybe years or even centuries ago. That night, I did some research in the park's historical archives. It didn't take long to find references to the singing stones in Cherokee oral traditions. According to the stories, there were places in the mountains where the rocks could capture voices and keep them forever. Sacred places where shamans would go to speak with the spirits of ancestors. The stories said the stones could also give warnings, singing danger songs when bad things were coming. They could guide lost people to safety by creating sounds that would lead them back to familiar territory. I'd never put much stock in Native American folklore before. As a geologist, I was trained to look for scientific explanations for natural phenomena. But lying in bed that night, listening to the wind in the trees outside my cabin, I kept hearing echoes of that impossible music. The next morning, I brought a sound engineer named Mike Garrett with me to document the phenomenon. Mike worked for the University of Kentucky and specialized in acoustic research. If anyone could explain what was happening in that chamber, it would be him. We made our way back to the hidden passage, and I helped Mike squeeze through with his recording equipment. As soon as we entered the crystal chamber, his eyes went wide. "Jesus, Kate," he whispered. "What is this place?" The crystals were singing again. The same complex harmonies I'd heard the day before. Mike set up his equipment and started recording, but within minutes, he was shaking his head in confusion. "This is impossible," he said, checking his instruments. "The frequencies I'm recording shouldn't be possible from natural formations. Some of these harmonics are in ranges that would require perfectly tuned resonant chambers, and others—" He trailed off, staring at his equipment. "Others are frequencies that shouldn't exist at all." The crystals seemed to respond to his presence the same way they had to mine. They grew brighter, their songs more elaborate. When Mike spoke, they'd echo back fragments of his words mixed with other sounds, voices that definitely weren't his or mine. We spent 3 hours in that chamber, and Mike filled 2 cassette tapes with recordings. When we finally made our way back to the surface, he was quiet for a long time. "Kate," he finally said, "I need to analyze these recordings in my lab, but I can tell you right now that whatever's happening in there doesn't follow any acoustic principles I understand. Those crystals aren't just making sounds. They're storing them and playing them back selectively. It's like they're thinking." That word hung between us as we walked back to the ranger station. Thinking. As if the crystals had some kind of intelligence, some way of choosing what sounds to make and when to make them. I was starting to realize that this discovery was bigger than just an interesting geological formation. Something was alive in that chamber, something that had been listening to voices for a very long time. Over the next 2 weeks, I visited the crystal chamber every day. I told myself it was for research purposes, to document the phenomenon and understand what was happening. But the truth was, I was fascinated by the music and the way the crystals seemed to respond to me. Each visit revealed something new. The crystals were growing, actually getting larger and more complex. New formations appeared almost daily, and each one added new voices to the choir. Sometimes I'd hear fragments of conversations in English, words and phrases that sounded like they came from different time periods. Pioneer settlers, maybe, or early tourists who had somehow found their way into the chamber decades ago. Other times the voices were clearly Cherokee. I brought a translation book and started recognizing some words. Many of them seemed to be related to ceremonies or rituals. Sacred words that had been spoken in this place long before white settlers ever saw Kentucky. But it was the newer voices that started to worry me. On Thursday of the second week, I heard my own voice coming from the crystals. Not an echo. I wasn't speaking at the time. It was a conversation I'd had with Mike during our first visit, played back word for word with perfect clarity. The crystals weren't just storing random sounds. They were recording everything that happened in their presence and filing it away somehow. Every word, every footstep, every breath was being captured and could be replayed at will. That same day, I brought a group of tourists through the main cave system on a regular guided tour. We were in the large chamber about a quarter mile from the crystal room when something strange happened. One of the tourists, an elderly man named Harold from Ohio, wandered away from the group while I was explaining the geological history of the formations. I noticed he was missing and went looking for him, expecting to find him stuck in one of the narrow passages that branched off from the main chamber. Instead, I found him standing perfectly still in a side tunnel I'd never seen before, listening to something with a peaceful expression on his face. "Harold?" I called. "We need to stay with the group." He turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Do you hear that, miss? That singing? It sounds just like my wife used to sing in church before she passed. How is that possible?" I listened, but all I could hear was the normal acoustic ambiance of the cave, water dripping somewhere, the distant murmur of the tour group's voices. But Harold was clearly hearing something that meant the world to him. As I led him back to the group, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The side tunnel he'd been standing in hadn't been there that morning. I'd walked past that exact spot when I arrived for work, and it had been solid limestone wall. Something was changing the cave system, creating new passages, new connections, and it was using them to reach out to people, to play them sounds they needed to hear. That weekend, 2 more incidents occurred that I couldn't explain away as coincidence or acoustic tricks. A family of 4 got separated from another tour group on Saturday. They wandered for 3 hours in passages that should have led them deeper into the mountain and potentially into serious danger. Instead, they somehow ended up at the main entrance, all of them insisting that they'd followed the sound of voices singing hymns that led them to safety. On Sunday, a teenage girl fell into a pit that opened up suddenly during a routine cave exploration. She dropped about 15 feet onto a rocky ledge, conscious but badly hurt with what looked like a broken leg. Her friends couldn't reach her, and my rescue team was 20 minutes away. But when we arrived, we found her calmly sitting on the edge of the pit, her injury somehow healed enough that she could climb out on her own. She insisted that she'd heard voices telling her exactly where to put her hands and feet to climb the rocky walls, and that the pain in her leg had simply stopped when she started listening to what the voices were telling her. The crystal chamber was doing more than just recording sounds. It was actively interfering in what happened in the cave system, helping people and guiding them to safety. But that meant it had influence far beyond its own chamber. The entire cave network was somehow connected to whatever intelligence lived in those singing stones. On Monday morning, I got a call that changed everything. "Ms. Branham, this is Robert Dixon from Appalachian Mining Corporation. I understand you've made some interesting discoveries in the Red River Gorge cave system." My Bluetooth indeed went cold. Appalachian Mining was one of the companies I'd worked for during my geology career. They were known for aggressive extraction techniques and a complete disregard for environmental protection. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Dixon." "Oh, I think you do. We've heard about some unusual crystal formations that might have commercial applications. Acoustic properties that could be very valuable in the right hands. We'd like to arrange a site visit." I hung up on him, but I knew it wouldn't matter. If Appalachian Mining had heard about the crystals, they'd find a way to get to them. They had lawyers and money and political connections that could override any protection I might try to put in place. That night, I made my way back to the crystal chamber. As soon as I entered, the singing changed. Instead of the usual complex harmonies, the crystals produced sounds that were unmistakably alarm calls. Sharp, urgent tones that made the hair on my arm stand up. They knew something was coming, something that threatened them. "I'm going to try to protect you," I said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to a bunch of rocks, but somehow certain they could understand me. "But I need to know what you are, what you can do." The singing stopped entirely. For a long moment, the chamber was completely silent. Then, one by one, the crystal formations began to glow brighter than I'd ever seen them. The light filled the chamber, and suddenly I was hearing voices more clearly than ever before. Cherokee voices, speaking in ceremonial tones. Pioneer voices, awed and frightened by what they'd discovered. Tourist voices from decades past, all mixed together in a chorus that seemed to span centuries. And underneath it all, something else. A voice that wasn't human at all, but somehow familiar. Ancient and patient, and very much alive. The crystals weren't just recording devices. They were a living entity, something that had been in this mountain for thousands of years. The Cherokee had known about it and had treated it as a sacred guardian spirit. Now it was trying, to protect itself from a threat it had seen before. The same kind of corporate destruction that had already scarred so much of Appalachian Kentucky. I understood then why my equipment malfunctioned around the crystals, why new passages appeared overnight, why people in trouble found themselves guided to safety by voices that shouldn't exist. The entity in the crystals had power over the cave system. It could reshape passages, influence the behavior of people inside its domain, and apparently even heal injuries when necessary. It was a guardian, doing what it could to protect both itself and the people who entered its territory. But Appalachian mining represented a threat it might not be able to handle alone. I didn't have to wait long to find out how serious the mining company was about getting to the crystals. Tuesday morning, I arrived at work to find 3 men in business suits waiting in the ranger station parking lot. "Ms. Branham," said the oldest of them, a tall man with gray hair and cold eyes that I remembered from my corporate days. "Robert Dixon, Appalachian Mining. We spoke yesterday. These are my associates, Dr. Marcus Webb and Mr. James Kowalski." Webb was clearly the scientist of the group. Thick glasses, nervous demeanor, the kind of man who saw everything as a problem to be solved. Kowalski looked like muscle, the kind of security consultant mining companies hired when they expected trouble. "Gentlemen," I said carefully, "I'm afraid I don't have time for unauthorized visits today. If you'd like to schedule a proper tour of the cave system—" "We're not here for a tour," Dixon interrupted. "We have legal authority to conduct a geological survey of this site." He handed me a folder full of official-looking documents. "Federal mining survey permit signed by the Department of the Interior. We understand there are some unique formations that warrant an investigation." My hands shook as I read through the paperwork. It all looked legitimate, which meant someone with serious political connections had fast-tracked this survey request. The permits gave them access to any part of the cave system they deemed relevant to their geological assessment. "Fine," I said, "but I accompany any survey team in my caves. Safety protocol." Dixon smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course, we wouldn't dream of operating without proper ranger supervision." I led them to the main cave entrance, desperately trying to think of ways to steer them away from the crystal chamber. But as soon as we entered the cave system, I realized it wouldn't matter what I did. The singing started immediately. It was louder than I'd ever heard it, echoing through the main passage with harmonies that seemed to come from every direction at once. Dixon and his team stopped walking, looking around in amazement. "Remarkable acoustic properties," Webb said, pulling out some kind of electronic measuring device. "The resonance characteristics are unlike anything I've documented." "Where exactly is that sound coming from?" Dixon asked me. I could have lied, should have lied, but the singing was so loud and so obviously coming from the direction of the hidden passage that there was no point in trying to misdirect them. "There's a chamber that was revealed by recent earthquake activity," I said. "The formations inside have unusual properties." "Show us." We made our way to the passage entrance, and I helped them climb up to the gap in the wall. As soon as we entered the crystal chamber, Webb started pulling out instruments and taking readings while Kowalski began examining the formations with the cold efficiency of someone evaluating merchandise. Incredible, Webb said. These crystals are producing sound through some kind of piezoelectric effect, but the complexity is far beyond anything natural. The acoustic properties alone would be worth millions in commercial applications. Dixon was studying the Cherokee artifacts scattered around the Cha. Member. How long have people known about this place? Based on the artifacts, probably centuries. The local Cherokee considered it sacred. Well, it's about to become sacred to our shareholders instead. He turned to Kowalski. Can we extract the crystal formations intact? Most of them, Kowalski said, running his hands over the singing stones. We'll need to bring in some heavy equipment, maybe blast out the chamber entrance to get machinery in here. But yeah, we can harvest probably 70% of the formations without too much damage. The moment he said the word blast, everything changed. The crystal singing became a shriek, a sound so loud and so filled with rage that all four of us had to cover our ears. The formations blazed with light, bright enough that I had to close my eyes, and I felt the ground beneath our feet begin to tremble. What the hell? Dixon started to say, but his words were cut off as one of the larger crystal formations suddenly cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The crack spread across the chamber wall, and chunks of limestone began falling from the ceiling. Not randomly, they were falling in a pattern that seemed designed to block the entrance we'd come through. We need to get out of here, I shouted over the crystal, screaming. Now! But when I turned toward the passage entrance, I saw that it was too late. Rocks had fallen in a neat pile that completely blocked our way out. We were trapped in the crystal chamber, and the formations around us were blazing with light and sound that felt like pure anger. Webb's instruments were going crazy, beeping and flashing with readings that were probably off the charts. Kowalski had pulled out what looked like a gun and was pointing it at the crystals as if he could shoot them into silence. The formations are destabilizing, Webb shouted. The acoustic frequencies are increasing beyond CCTs of levels. That's when I realized what was happening. The crystal entity wasn't just angry about the threat to itself. It was defending its territory the only way it knew how, by using its control over the cave system to eliminate the threat. More cracks appeared in the walls, and I could see that they weren't random. They were forming a pattern, reshaping the chamber according to some plan that the crystal intelligence had devised. New passages were opening while others closed, and through it all the singing continued. Not random noise now, but something that sounded almost like battle cries. It's alive, I said, mostly to myself. The whole formation is alive, and it's fighting back. Dixon stared at me. That's impossible. Rock formations don't... His words were cut off as the floor beneath his feet suddenly gave way. He fell about 6 feet into a pit that definitely hadn't been there moments before, and when he tried to climb out, the walls seemed to shift to keep him trapped. Kowalski raised his gun and fired 3 shots at the nearest crystal formation. The bullets bounced off harmlessly, but the sound of gunfire seemed to enrage the entity even further. The chamber filled with ultrasonic frequencies that made my head feel like it was going to explode. Stop! I shouted at Kowalski. You're making it worse! But he was beyond listening. He kept firing at the crystals, and with each shot, the acoustic assault grew more intense. Webb had collapsed to his knees, blood streaming from his ears. I realized that the crystal entity was going to kill all of us if I didn't do something. It couldn't distinguish between the threat and the innocent bystander. It just knew that humans had entered its domain with the intention of destroying it. Please, I called out to the crystals, not sure if they could understand English, but desperate to communicate. I'm not with them. I want to protect you. The ultrasonic shrieking stopped instantly. The chamber fell silent except for Dixon's groans from the pit and Webb's labored breathing. Then, slowly, the crystals began to sing again. But this time, the melody was different, softer, more questioning. And mixed in with the crystal voices, I could hear human ones. Cherokee voices speaking words I was beginning to understand. Friend, they seemed to be saying. Protector, help us. I looked around the chamber and saw that new crystal formations had grown during the chaos, blocking several passages that Kowalski might have used to escape. The entity was giving me a choice. I could help it eliminate the threat permanently, or I could try to find another solution. "I'll get them out of here," I said to the crystals, "but you have to let me do it my way." The singing shifted to what I could only interpret as agreement. It took me 3 hours to negotiate everyone's safe passage out of the crystal chamber. The entity was willing to let Dixon, Webb, and Kowalski leave alive, but only after I convinced it that killing them would bring even more attention from the mining company. Instead, we worked out a different solution. The crystals used their control over the cave system to create a series of small cave-ins and rockfalls that made the passage to their chamber completely inaccessible. Not just blocked, genuinely destroyed, as if it had never existed. When we finally made it back to the main cave passage, there was no sign that there had ever been an opening in that wall. Webb's instruments had been destroyed by the ultrasonic frequencies, and all 3 men had suffered hearing damage that would take weeks to heal. More importantly, they had no physical evidence that the crystal chamber existed. Without proof, Appalachian mining couldn't justify the expense of a full-scale mining operation. I filed my official report that afternoon. Geological survey inconclusive due to unstable conditions caused by recent seismic activity. Cave system deemed unsafe for commercial operations. EA recommended for closure to public access pending structural assessment. The federal permits were quietly withdrawn a week later, but my relationship with the crystal entity was just beginning. Over the next few months, I developed a communication system with the intelligence in the stones. It couldn't speak English, but it could replay fragments of conversations it had recorded over the centuries. By listening carefully to which phrases it chose and when it used them, I learned to understand what it was trying to tell me. The entity was old, far older than the Cherokee stories suggested. It had been in the mountain for thousands of years, learning from every person who entered its domain. The Cherokee shamans had been the first to recognize its intelligence and treat it as a sacred guardian. They'd brought it offerings and performed ceremonies that helped it grow stronger and more aware. In return, it had protected the mountain and the people who lived near it. Cave-ins that prevented dangerous expeditions, sounds that guided lost travelers to safety, healing frequencies that could mend broken bones and ease pain. The mining threat had been just the latest in a long series of dangers it had faced, but it was getting harder to protect itself as technology advanced and corporate interests became more aggressive. I became its ally in that fight. Using my geological expertise, I helped the entity understand how to create more effective barriers against human intrusion. In return, it shared knowledge with me, geological information that helped me predict and prevent cave-ins, acoustic techniques that made search and rescue operations more effective. The tourists never knew what was helping them when they got lost in the cave system and found themselves guided to safety by mysterious voices. The local Cherokee families understood better, and several of them started bringing traditional offerings to the main cave entrance: tobacco, cornmeal, small pieces of turquoise that the entities seemed to appreciate. 6 months after the mining incident, I was promoted to head ranger for the entire Red River Gorge Preserve. The promotion came with expanded authority to protect the cave systems from commercial exploitation. I used that authority well. A year later, the Red River Gorge received enhanced federal protection status. The Crystal Chamber area was designated as a restricted research zone, accessible only to authorized scientific personnel. I made sure I was the only person with authorization. Mike Garrett, the sound engineer who had helped me document the first recordings, became a trusted ally. He published several papers on unusual acoustic phenomena in limestone cave systems that helped establish the scientific legitimacy of protecting the area without revealing the true nature of what we'd discovered. As for me, the experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. Spending so much time in proximity to the crystal entity enhanced my hearing somehow. I can detect sounds that other people miss, and I've developed an intuitive understanding of cave acoustics that has made me better at my job than I ever thought possible. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the main cave passage, I can still hear the singing. Faint but persistent, like a conversation in another room. The entity is always there, always listening, always ready to protect its mountain home. I train my replacement carefully, making sure they understand that the Red River Gorge caves are special in ways that can't be quantified or explained in official reports. The protection must continue, generation after generation, because some guardians have been watching over this land far longer than human civilization has existed. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, tourists camping near the gorge sometimes report hearing music coming from deep underground. Beautiful, complex harmonies that seem to tell stories of ancient ceremonies and timeless protection. The singing stones remember everything. Every voice, every word, every promise made in their presence, including mine. I promise to protect them, and that's a promise I intend to keep for the rest of my life. The mountain is in good hands, both human and otherwise.